Machines echoed through construction sites while Steve stood there staring into space. One afternoon, his longtime friend and business partner Mark quietly pulled him aside. "You okay?" Steve forced a weak nod. But Mark knew him too well. The two men had worked together for more than 30 years. They survived recessions, layoffs, injuries, and brutal winters together. Mark lowered his voice. "Whatever happened, don't make permanent decisions while you're angry." Steve looked away. Because anger was the only thing keeping him standing. That evening, Steve drove to a quiet lake outside the city. He sat alone inside his truck watching the water move beneath the fading sunlight. For the first time in years, he cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silently. The kind of crying that comes from a man who spent decades trying to be strong for everyone else. Steve thought about all the sacrifices he made for his family. The overtime shifts. The missed vacations. The sleepless nights worrying about bills when Tyler was young. The years he pushed himself beyond exhaustion because he wanted his wife and son to have a better life than he had growing up. And now he felt like a stranger inside his own story. Tyler noticed immediately. At 26 years old, Tyler worked as a high school history teacher in Milwaukee. He had always been close to Steve. Very close. Too close for this truth to feel survivable. One Friday evening, Tyler drove down unexpectedly. Steve heard the front door open. Then footsteps moving across the living room. "Dad, what's going on?" Steve stayed silent. Tyler looked toward Julia. Her eyes were already filled with tears. That was enough. The truth finally entered the room. Tyler listened quietly while Julia explained everything. The affair. The uncertainty. The fear. The lie. At first Tyler looked numb. Then confused. Then completely shattered. When Julia finished speaking, Tyler turned toward Steve. Not toward the woman who lied. Toward Steve. The man who raised him. "Dad." Steve could not answer. He simply walked out of the room. That night, Steve sat alone inside his garage holding an old baseball glove. Tyler's glove. The leather was cracked from years of use. And suddenly memories began attacking him one after another. Tyler at 6 years old learning how to throw. Tyler at 11 crying after losing a championship game. Tyler graduating college. Tyler hugging him after Steve survived a heart attack several years earlier. Every memory felt painfully real. Because they were real. That was the part Steve struggled to understand. The betrayal was real. But the love had been real too. And somehow both truths existed together. The following week became unbearable. Julia's health continued declining. Tyler stayed nearby to help. But tension filled every room of the house. No one knew how to speak anymore. No one knew how to carry the weight of what had happened. Then one cold Thursday evening, Steve returned home to find Tyler sitting alone on the back porch. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard. Steve almost turned around and went back inside. But Tyler spoke first. "You hate me now?" The question hit Steve harder than he expected. Slowly, he walked over and sat beside him. "No." Tyler stared into the darkness. "You don't even look at me anymore." Steve swallowed hard. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Tyler laughed bitterly. "You know what's crazy? I spent my whole life trying to become like you." Steve looked down at his hands. Tyler continued speaking. "You taught me how to work hard. You taught me how to respect people. You stayed up helping me with homework. You worked extra hours so I could go to college." His voice cracked. "You're my dad." Steve immediately looked away because tears had begun forming in his eyes. I don't even know who my biological father is." Silence settled heavily between them. Then Tyler asked the question Steve feared most. "Do you still want me in your life?" The pain in his voice nearly destroyed him. Because for the first time since discovering the truth, Steve realized something important. Tyler was hurting too. Maybe even more. Steve had lost certainty. But Tyler had lost identity. Steve inhaled shakily. Then finally spoke. "You're still my son." Tyler covered his face and broke down crying. And for the first time in weeks, Steve hugged him. Tyler held onto him tightly, like a frightened child trying not to drown. And suddenly Steve remembered something he had forgotten in the middle of all his pain. Tyler never lied to him. Tyler never betrayed him. Tyler had loved him honestly from the very beginning. That realization changed something deep inside Steve. Because pain has a dangerous way of turning innocent people into emotional casualties. And Steve refused to let Tyler become one of them. Not because biology demanded it. Because love did. Inside the kitchen, Julia watched through the window with tears streaming down her face. Because the two people she hurt most still loved each other deeply. Even after everything. And that realization broke her heart. If this story is touching your heart so far, take a moment to subscribe to the second act. This channel shares powerful stories about love, betrayal, redemption, heartbreak, healing, and second chances. Stories that remind us how complicated life can become, and how strong people must be to keep loving anyway. A few days later, Steve drove Julia to chemotherapy. The hospital waiting room felt painfully quiet. Families sat scattered beneath harsh fluorescent lighting. Some prayed silently. Others stared blankly at televisions mounted on the walls. Fear existed everywhere. Julia looked exhausted. Steve noticed how thin her hands had become. For years he imagined betrayal as something that instantly destroys love forever. But now, watching Julia fight for her life, emotions became far more complicated. Because despite the anger, despite the lies, despite the heartbreak, he still loved her. And that confused him. As they waited, Julia finally spoke. "I never stopped loving you." Steve stared ahead. "You should have told me the truth." "I know. You stole 26 years from me." Julia nodded slowly. "I was terrified you would leave." Steve clenched his jaw. "And maybe I would have." That honesty hung painfully between them. Because younger versions of themselves might not have survived the truth. Young pride often mistakes anger for strength. But life changes people. Pain changes people. Loss changes people. Later that night, Steve sat alone flipping through old family photo albums. Page after page of memories. Camping trips. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations. Tyler asleep on his chest during movie nights. Tyler wearing Steve's oversized football jersey as a child. And suddenly Steve realized something that changed everything. None of those moments were fake. The lie surrounding them was real. But the love inside those memories was real too. And maybe adulthood means learning that beautiful things and painful things often exist side by side. The following week, Tyler finally received information about the man believed to be his biological father. His name was Richard Jess. A former co-worker of Julia's from decades earlier. He now lived in Arizona. Tyler sat quietly holding the paper. Steve watched from across the room. "You going to call him?" Tyler hesitated. "I don't know. Do you want to?" Tyler rubbed his hands together nervously. "I spent my whole life believing I knew who I was. Now everything feels uncertain." Steve nodded slowly. He understood that feeling better than anyone. Several days later, Tyler finally made the phone call. Richard answered on the third ring. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. Steve remained in the kitchen pretending not to listen. But every second felt heavy. When Tyler finally hung up, his eyes looked red. How did it go? Tyler sat down slowly. He didn't know. Steve frowned. What do you mean? Mom never told him. Tyler looked emotionally exhausted. He cried. That surprised Steve. Tyler continued speaking softly. He said he always wondered why Mom suddenly quit the company. The room fell silent again. Then Tyler added something unexpected. He asked about you. Steve looked up. He said any man can help create a child, but not every man stays. Steve immediately looked away. Because after weeks of emotional pain, those words shattered the walls he had built around himself. That evening, Steve drove alone for nearly 2 hours. No destination. No music. Just empty roads and memories. He remembered Tyler at 5 years old waiting by the front window for him to come home from work. He remembered Tyler refusing to sleep unless Steve read him bedtime stories. He remembered teaching Tyler how to shave. Teaching him how to drive. Teaching him how to survive heartbreak. And slowly, Steve began understanding something that would change his life forever. Fatherhood had never been about blood. It had always been about presence. About sacrifice. About choosing someone every single day. When Steve returned home that night, Julia was asleep in her hospital bed. Machines beeped softly around her. The room smelled faintly of medicine and antiseptic. Steve sat quietly beside her. Watching. Thinking. Remembering. Eventually Julia opened her eyes. She looked startled to see him. Steve. He leaned back quietly. For weeks I kept telling myself my whole life was fake. Julia's face tightened with fear. But it wasn't. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Steve looked toward the floor. What you did was wrong. I may never completely understand it. Julia nodded silently. But Tyler is my son. His voice cracked. I raised him. I loved him. I watched him become a good man. Steve inhaled deeply. No DNA test can erase that. Julia began sobbing. Slowly, she reached for his hand. For several seconds Steve stared at it. Then finally held it. And both of them cried. Not because everything was fixed. But because healing had finally begun. Over the next month, life slowly changed. Not perfectly. Not magically. But honestly. For the first time in decades, there were no lies inside the Johnson family. Conversations became more honest. Sometimes painfully honest. There were nights Steve and Julia cried together. Nights they argued. Nights they sat quietly holding hands without saying anything at all. But slowly, walls that had formed between them began coming down. One evening, Julia admitted something she had carried for years. I was afraid every single day that you would find out. Steve looked at her quietly. Julia wiped tears from her face. I would watch you playing with Tyler and feel guilty. Every birthday party hurt. Every Father's Day hurt. I kept thinking one day everything would collapse. Steve stared toward the window. And now it has. Julia shook her head slowly. No. Not completely. Steve looked at her. Because somehow, after all the damage I caused, you still stayed. Steve did not answer right away. Because the truth was complicated. Part of him still felt broken. Part of him still felt angry. But another part of him understood something important. People are more than the worst mistake they ever made. And love is sometimes tested most when life becomes unfair. Tyler visited often. Steve slowly began laughing again. Julia continued treatments. Some days brought hope. Other days brought fear. Then one Sunday afternoon, Tyler invited Steve to a baseball field outside Milwaukee. Children practiced while parents watched from metal bleachers. "What are we doing here?" Tyler smiled. "Just wait." A few moments later, a little boy around 7 years old came running toward them. "Dad!" The child jumped directly into Tyler's arms. Steve blinked in confusion. Beside Tyler stood a woman smiling warmly. "This is Emma. And this little guy is Caleb." Steve stared in complete shock. "You have a son?" Tyler laughed nervously. "I wanted to tell you at the right time." Steve looked at the little boy. The child looked back curiously. "Who are you?" Tyler smiled. "This is your grandpa." The word hit Steve like lightning. Grandpa. Emotion flooded through him instantly. The little boy held up a baseball glove. "Do you want to play catch?" Steve laughed through tears. "Yeah. I'd like that." As the sun lowered across the field, Steve tossed the baseball back and forth with Caleb. The child laughed every time he missed. Tyler watched quietly nearby. And suddenly Steve understood something life had been trying to teach him all along. Real fathers stay. Real fathers show up. Real fathers choose love again and again, even when life becomes painful. Weeks later, Julia's condition worsened. Doctors became more honest. There was no cure. Only time. One evening the family gathered inside Julia's hospital room. Steve sat beside her bed. Tyler stood near the window. Little Caleb colored quietly in the corner. Julia looked exhausted. But peaceful. She watched Steve helping Caleb draw a baseball player. Tears slowly formed in her eyes. "What?" Steve asked softly. Julia smiled weakly. "You became the best thing that ever happened to us." Steve lowered his head. For years he measured success through money and business achievements. But sitting in that hospital room, he realized the greatest thing he ever built was his family. Even imperfect families can still be beautiful. Late that night, after Tyler and Caleb left, Julia spoke quietly. "When I'm gone, promise me something." Steve looked away immediately. "Don't talk like that." "No. Listen to me." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Promise me you won't close your heart." Steve stayed silent. "You spent weeks believing love was destroyed by truth." Tears rolled down Steve's face. "But love survived anyway." Julia smiled faintly. "That means something." 2 weeks later, Julia passed away peacefully before sunrise. Steve was holding her hand. Tyler stood beside him. The room remained completely silent except for quiet crying. After the funeral, life felt unbearably empty. The house echoed. Mornings became difficult. Steve still reached toward Julia's side of the bed sometimes before remembering she was gone. Grief arrived unexpectedly. At grocery stores. At traffic lights. While hearing songs on the radio. But slowly, something else arrived too. Perspective. One evening Steve sat on the porch while Caleb chased fireflies across the yard. Tyler handed Steve a beer and sat beside him. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Then Tyler finally asked softly, "You okay?" Steve exhaled slowly. "Trying to be." Tyler nodded. "You know, I used to think strength meant never breaking." Steve looked toward him. "But maybe real strength is rebuilding after you do." Steve smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like something he once taught Tyler. Funny how life works. The lessons we give others eventually return to us. Months later, Steve sold part of his construction company and began working fewer hours. For the first time in decades, he prioritized life over business. He attended Caleb's baseball games, traveled more, started volunteering with a mentorship program for boys growing up without fathers. And every Thursday evening, he visited Julia's grave. Not with bitterness, not with hatred, but with honesty. Because healing does not erase pain. It teaches people how to carry it differently. One autumn afternoon, Steve sat at a park bench watching Caleb play nearby. A younger father sat beside him holding a sleeping toddler. The man looked exhausted. Kids change everything, huh? Steve chuckled softly. Yeah. They do. The young father stared down at his child. I'm terrified I'll mess him up somehow. Steve watched Caleb laughing across the playground. Then smiled. You will. The younger man looked horrified. Steve laughed. We all do. Then his expression softened. But if you love him consistently, really love him, that's what he'll remember most. The young father nodded thoughtfully. Steve leaned back against the bench. For a long time, he believed the greatest betrayal of his life was learning Tyler was not biologically his. But time eventually revealed a deeper truth. The greatest gift of his life was that Tyler still became his son anyway. Sometimes the families that survive the hardest truths become the strongest ones of all. Sometimes love grows deeper after pain. Sometimes forgiveness becomes the thing that finally sets people free. And sometimes the second act becomes the most meaningful part of the story. If you've made it this far into the story, subscribe to the second act for more emotional journeys about heartbreak, redemption, second chances, family, healing, and resilience. Stories that remind us life is never perfect, people are never flawless, and love is often stronger than the pain trying to destroy it. As the sun slowly began setting across the park, Caleb suddenly ran toward Steve laughing. Grandpa. Grandpa. Watch this. Steve stood smiling. And for the first time in a very long time, his heart finally felt whole again.